So when we talk about history, very often it is the history of those who have won, those who are in power, and for sure, a white hand is the historian, especially for us who live in this land. When women talk about history, they usually talk about it from the perspective of his story. So women usually are left out. And for all of us who have been studying scripture together, we say how often that has happened over the centuries, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So tonight we begin our reading together. And I would like us to imagine just simply maybe even closing your eyes and listen to the reader as she would share with us this story. Imagine we were at a campfire and we're just listening to the untold story, listening to the story that beats in our own hearts, moves in our own blood, and yet has not been taught in our schools, shared from our pulpits very often. But this story is our story, and we need to hear it. And so what we're going to do is there'll be sections read by different readers, and I'll announce who the reader is at each point. And we'll take a moment, literally a moment of silence, just to kind of absorb. And then if there's any sharing, and then we'll start the next part. So we're not sure where we're going to get to tonight. Tonight will be kind of an experiment for all of us and how this all fits into an hour. We're going to read tonight the preface, or at least begin to read the preface tonight. But I want to start with the poem that leads off the book by Langston Hughes. I am the American heartbreak, the rock on which freedom stumped its toe, the great mistake that Jamestown made long ago. And so Cheryl Leacock is going to lead us off with the beginning of the preface, Origins, by Nicole Hannah Jones.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I was maybe 15 or 16 when I first came across the date 1619. Whenever I think about that moment, my mind conjures an image of glowing three-dimensional numbers rising from the page. Of course, in reality, they were printed in plain black text on the cheap page of a paperback. Still, while the numbers did not literally grow, I remember sitting back in my chair and staring at the date, a bit confused, thrown off kilter by an exhilarating revelation staring to sink in. For as long as I can remember, I have been fascinated with the past. Even as a young girl, I loved watching documentaries and feature films about events that took place in a bygone era. As a middle school student, I read all of my dad's Louis L'Amour Westerns and the entire Little House series because they transported me to the mythic American frontier. I loved sitting in my grandparents' basement, leafing through age photo albums filmed with square black and white images and asking questions about the long dead relatives frozen in the frame. My favorite subjects in school were English and social studies, and I peppered my teachers with questions. History revealed the building blocks of the world I now inhabited, explaining how communities, institutions, relationships came to be. Learning history made the world make sense. It provided the key to decode all that I saw around me. Black people, however, were largely absent from the histories I read. The visions of the past I absorbed from school textbooks, television, and the local history museum depicted a world, perhaps a wishful one, where Black people did not really exist. This history rendered Black Americans, Black people, Black people on all the earth, inconsequential at best, invisible at worst. We appeared only where unavoidable. Slavery was mentioned briefly in the chapter, and on this nation's most deadly war, and then Black people disappeared again for a full century until magically reappearing as Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech about a dream. This quantum leap served to wrap the Black experience up in few paragraphs and a tidy bow, never really explaining why, 100 years after the abolition of slavery, King had to lead the March on Washington in the first place. We were not actors, but acted upon. We were not contributors, just recipients. White people enslaved us, and white people freed us. Black people could choose either to take advantage of that freedom or to squander it. As our depictions in the media seem to suggest so many of us were doing. The world revealed to me through my education was a white one, and yet my intimate world, my neighborhood, my friends, I rode the bus with for 2 hours each day to and from the schools on the white side of town. The boisterous bevy of aunts, uncles, and cousins who crowded our home for barbecues and card games was largely Black. At school, I searched desperately to find myself in the American story we were taught, to see my humanity, our humanity, reflected back to me. I snatched Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, from our elementary school library shelf because it was the one book with a Black girl on the cover. In high school, when my advanced placement English teacher assigned us a final project on a famous American literary figure, I wrote about the only Black poet I had been exposed to, Langston Hughes. My public high school in Waterloo, Iowa, offered a one-semester elective called the African American Experience, which I took my sophomore year. Only other Black kids filled the seats each day. And the only Black male teacher I ever had taught the course. Rail thin and mahogany skinned, with a booming laugh that revealed the wide gap between his front teeth. Mr. Ray Dial deftly navigated our class through the ancient Mali, Songhai, and Nubian and Ghana empires. It was he who taught me that from here to Timbuktu referred to an African center of learning, surveying the cultures and knowledge and civilizations that existed among African peoples long before Europeans decided that millions of human beings could be forced across the ocean in the hulls of ships and then redefined as property. He taught us about Richard Allen, founding the first independent Black denomination on this soil, and how hard enslaved people fought for the legal right to do things every other race took for granted, such as reading or marrying or keeping your own children. He taught us about Black resistance and Black writers. He taught us about Martin, but also Marcus and Malcolm and Mamie and Fanny. Sitting in that class each day, I felt as if I had spent my entire life struggling to breathe, and someone had finally provided me with oxygen. I feel a pang of embarrassment now when I recall to my surprise, that so many books existed about Black people and by Black people, that Black people had so much history that could be learned. I felt at once angry and empowered, and these dueling emotions drove an appetite for learning Black American history that has never left me. I began asking Mr. Dial for books to read beyond the assigned texts, devouring them, then asking for others. Dr. Hanna, he exclaimed one day, flashing his trademark toothy grin as he put a book in my hands, Before the Mayflower, by the historian and journalist Lerone Bennett Jr. As soon as I got home that afternoon, I sat down at our dining room table and pulled it from my book bag. A few pages in, I read these words. She came out of a violent storm with a story no one believed. A year before the arrival of the celebrated Mayflower, 113 years before the birth of George Washington, 244 years before the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, this ship sailed into the harbor at Jamestown, Virginia, and dropped anchor into the muddy waters of history. It was clear to the men who received this Dutch man of war that she was no ordinary vessel. What seemed unusual today is that no one sensed how extraordinary she really was. For few ships before or since have unloaded a more momentous cargo. Wait, I had assumed that before the Mayflower referred to Black people's history in Africa before they were enslaved on this land. Tracing my fingers across the words, I realized that the title evoked not a remote African history, but an American one. African people had lived here on the land that in 1776 would form the United States. Since the White Lion dropped anchor in the year 1619, then arrived 1 year before the iconic ship carrying the English people who got credit for building it all. Why hadn't any teacher or textbook in telling history of Jamestown taught us the story of 1619? No history can be complete. Of course, millions of moments, thousands of dates weave the tapestry of a country's past. But I knew immediately, viscerally, that this was not an innocuous omission. The year white Virginians first purchased enslaved Africans, the start of American slavery, an institution so influential and corrosive that it both helped create the nation and nearly led to its decline, its demise. It's beautifully a foundational historical date, and yet I have never heard of it before.
Good. We're going to stop here and just take a moment to take some of that in. And what I'm looking for would be, what are you feeling about that? In terms of what history did you learn? Do you feel like history was denied to you? Surely when I read this book, I was just so overwhelmed with the fact that this was a history I never heard.
Mm.
I don't know if you all have any similar feelings.
I thank Ms. Leacock for the reading. However, this makes me very angry, very sad. Not confused, just angry and sad. That we have been brought here where others were, misled, and folks would still like to continue the game.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Thank you, Ms. Curtis.
I think that the history that we're learning about, we're taught in our homes, but our schools teach us things that are different. So there's always confusion in what's right and what's wrong. So I feel like this is starting to bring out what we're learning at home into the public's eye or into the school system.
Yeah.
So now it starts to question what we've been learning all the time. And anytime America is questioned, there's always going to be issues.
Mm-hmm.
As I was
Yeah.
reading it, a lot of different emotions actually. First of all, I never knew the date until this book, and then I started to do a little research. But certain parts of it, just the shock of it, and I think for me, as a Black person, I felt almost invisible. Like, why were we never taught this? Africans were brought here. That date was never taught to us. So it was almost as though they didn't exist. They were invisible, obviously, to the people writing it. And like Miss Curtis said, it's like heartbreaking. It makes you feel angry. It's so many different emotions, um, interchangeably.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you could say then, if this is the way history is being taught to us, it's no wonder that white privilege is so embedded in
Mhm.
how we live on this land. It's just because it's told from that perspective, from the perspective of power and money over. Cheryl Vaughn is going to, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, someone else.
Sorry, Father Feely. And almost as you say that, it's a disservice not only to Black people, but it's a disservice to everyone, white children learning the history, being taught the history.
Yep.
It's a disservice to all of us.
Yeah. And I think maybe the anger that it raised for me when I read it the first time was they lied to me.
Mhm.
That's the feeling. I've been lied to
Mhm.
about our history. I mean, surely, in reading the history and even reading the diaries of Christopher Columbus, Jackie was doing that a few years back. I mean, they're pretty awful. And then to make a great hero of the guy is really sickening. It's the same idea that the conquerors decided what history we were to learn. And so I just think it's an essential spiritual thing that we teach the whole story. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Cheryl Vaughn, if you would pick up here.
Brother Daly, this is Anthony.
Yes.
Hello. I want to add to you.
Okay.
The feeling I had immediately was I was tricked.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
tricked.
Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that one sentence when I read the preface about they had arrived 1 year before the iconic ship carrying the English
Yes.
people.
That's right. That's right.
And that's really where we start our history is the English people arrived here.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's a feeling of being tricked. Thank
Mhm.
you.
Yeah. Thank you. Just to throw this in that you mentioned it that way, Kelly Brown, who's the priest, who's the dean of the Episcopal Seminary up at Union, she puts it this way. She said the goal of that English ship was to create an Anglo-Saxon world, and no one else fit into it. And so when you read some of Kelly's books, that's the realization that you come up with, that from its inception, it was geared towards, moved in a particular direction to obviously go against anyone who lived here, like Native American peoples.
Yeah.
Yeah, and any person that we kind of umbrella now under people of color, but all people who were not white. And that's the crime, the sin.
Mhm.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all.
Good evening, all.
Good evening.
Even as a teenager, I understood that the absence of 1619 from mainstream history was intentional. People had made the choice not to teach us the significance of the year, and it followed that many other facts of history had been ignored or suppressed as well. What else hadn't we been taught? I was starting to figure out that the histories we learn in school are more casually through popular culture, monuments, and political speeches rarely teach us the facts, but only certain facts. In the United States, few examples better reveal this than how we're taught about the foundational American institution of slavery. A 2018 report by the Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, called Teaching Hard History, found that in 2017, just 8% of US high school seniors named slavery as the central cause of the Civil War, and less than 1/3 knew that it had taken a constitutional amendment to abolish it. The majority of high school students can't tell you that the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass had once been enslaved, nor can they define the Middle Passage, which led to the forced migration of nearly 13 million people across the Atlantic and transformed or arguably enabled the existence of the United States. Considering the confusing and obfuscatory ways school curricula tend to address the institution of slavery, this is unsurprising. Myriad examples exist. As recently as 6 years ago, a McGraw-Hill World Geography textbook referred to African people brought to the Americas in the bowels of slave ships, not as the victims of a forced migration who were violently coerced into labor, but as workers, a word that implies consensual and paid labor. Within the last decade, Alabama social studies courses for second graders listed Harriet Tubman, the woman who became famous for escaping slavery and then helping others do the same, as an exemplary American without ever mentioning the word slave or slavery. In Texas, which, because of its large population, plays an outsized role in shaping the content of national textbooks, the Republican led State Board of Education approved curriculum standards that equated the Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who fought against the United States government, with Douglass as examples of the importance of effective leadership in a constitutional republic. School curricula generally treat slavery as an aberration in a free society, and textbooks largely ignore the way that many prominent men, women, industries, and institutions profited from and protected slavery. Individual enslaved people, as full humans with feelings, thoughts, and agency, remain largely invisible, but for the occasional brief mention of Douglass or Tubman or George Washington Carver. One of the reasons American children so poorly understand the history and legacy of slavery is because the adults charged with teaching them don't know it very well either. A 2019 Washington Post SSRS poll found that only about half of American adults realized that all 13 colonies engaged in slavery. Even educators struggle with basic facts of history. The SPLC report found only about half of US teachers understand that enslavers dominated the presidency in the decades after the founding and would dominate the US Supreme Court and the US Senate until the Civil War. Of more than 1,700 social studies teachers surveyed in the SPLC study, a bare majority say they feel competent to teach about slavery. Most say that the available resources and preparation programs have failed them. As the renowned slavery historian Ira Berlin wrote in an essay in Slavery and Public History, The Tough Stuff of American Memory, the simple truth is that most Americans know little about the 300-year history of slavery in mainland North America with respect to peoples of African descent, and almost nothing of its effect on the majority of white Americans. Berlin, who was white and who died in 2018, contributed to a wave of important research and scholarship in the past 50 years, much of it by Black historians that challenged those prevailing views about American history. The work of these scholars, who are often inspired to ask new questions about our past by focusing on primary source material inaccessible to or ignored by previous generations, has made clear the central role that slavery and anti-Blackness played in the development of our society and its institutions. To argue otherwise among professional historians is now widely understood to be anachronistic and ahistorical. But this scholarship, so uncontroversial among historians, has often struggled to permeate mainstream understanding of American history, which is still wedded to a mythology of our founders as unimpeachable heroes and our founding as divine event. There is, as the historian Jelani Cobb told me, a gap between the academy and the world. So while scholars of color and progressive white scholars have spent decades fighting and, for the most part, winning these battles in the academy and in the profession, they've remained isolated from the rest of the world. As a result, the American public has an outdated and vague sense of the past. And yet, the 2019 Washington Post poll found that despite their meager knowledge of slavery, 2/3 of Americans believe that the legacy of slavery still affects our society today. They can see and feel the truth of this fact. They just haven't learned a history that helps them understand how and why. We are committing educational malpractice, says Hassan Kwame Jeffries, a historian at Ohio State University. Jeffries serves as chair of the advisory board that produced the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Hard History report. Our preference for nostalgia and for a history that never happened is not without consequence, Jeffries writes. Although we teach students that slavery happened, in some cases, we minimize slavery's significance so much that we render its impact on people and on the nation inconsequential. This, Jeffries continues, is profoundly troubling because it leaves Americans ill-equipped to understand racial inequality today, and that in turn leads to intolerance, opposition to efforts to address racial injustice, and the enacting of laws and policies detrimental to Black communities and America writ large. Our narrow understanding of the institution prevents us from seeing this long legacy and leads policymakers to try to fix people instead of addressing the historically rooted causes of their problems, he notes. In other words, we all suffer for the poor history we've been taught.
Thank you. So we're going to again take this moment to just kind of bring all of that in. A lot of stuff.
In listening to what we just heard from Cheryl,
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was in school, elementary school, I can distinctly remember that when we learned about Black history, I don't think the book, it was more than 4 pages.
Wow.
It was like very brief. They mentioned Harriet Tubman, and like very few people, George Washington Carver, very few people, but it didn't go into any detail that I learned in regards to slavery or anything to do with Black people was later on in life. It was never taught.
Yeah.
All of this is now like something that's like brand new. It's like we're learning now. We're now learning about our own history.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else?
I'm trying to find it again, the part where they said they treat the history of the country as if it's divine, like it's a
Mhm.
divine event.
Right.
And it made me laugh because I had this, I won't say argument, like a debate at school with another teacher about that, because I was talking about the fact that the kids don't know anything about their history, and we should be teaching that
Mhm.
in social studies. But I had given the kids a project, and half of them, despite the fact that my school is literally 5 blocks from the Apollo Theater, had no idea where it was or what it was.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
And I was talking and saying we should take the kids on a tour because it's right down the street so they can see it. I'm like, because I said, like, people come from other countries to
Mhm.
visit the Apollo Theater because they know the significance of the Apollo Theater. And how is it that you all live in this neighborhood and you have no idea?
Yeah.
Not even parents knew the significance of the Apollo Theater. And he was like, well, the history. I'm like, but you all make history seem so glamorous, and it's not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not. So we need to teach them about their history so we don't repeat it, one, and they know where they come from.
Yes. Yeah.
They have to know where they came from.
But to piggyback off of what you're saying, other people in other countries get news differently from how we get the news. The news is
Mhm.
pretty
Yeah.
much watered down for
Well,
us.
yeah.
So when they're getting the news, they're getting the actual history that we're
Yeah.
not getting or we're not seeing.
And that was my point to her, because I said to her, it's a crying shame that I was not born in this country, but I can tell you about your history.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I'm telling other
because-
Black teachers in the school about their history, and they're
Mhm.
looking at me like, how do you know that? And I don't.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You know, and I
Because-
said,
because-
because I had to learn it.
Mhm.
I didn't want to learn it. I was like, why am I learning all this? It doesn't pertain to me. But now, of course, as you get older, you realize it does. And that's why they were teaching it to me. But
Yeah.
they're like, how do you know it? And I don't.
The system appeared to have been a system of drop names.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Their method of informing their people is just to drop the name and keep moving.
Yeah.
And there was no way for them to research what these people were, who they were, what they did, or whatever. There was no way for them to go, but they may know of the names, and that was satisfactory to their founders,
Yeah.
Mhm.
which is just very sad.
It is really very sad. It's angering, and it's sad, and it's, you know, all of those words that go with it. It makes you mad, because it makes me mad.
I went to a public school for grade school, and in my class, I would say there were, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 white kids, and the rest of the class was Latin and Black. And of course, none of this was ever taught to us. As a matter of fact, I don't think I heard of Harriet Tubman until maybe I was in college. That's a sad statement about how we teach history in this country. And if I didn't hear it, of course, the other kids in the class didn't hear it. And they didn't know their story either.
It's true. I was in my junior high school, in the American history, there was only not even a page of Black history in that history book.
Mhm.
The only thing that really stuck to my head was Crispus Attucks. That's what stuck to my head. Crispus Attucks was the only first black person to get killed in the Civil War.
We
Wow.
must have had the same book.
That's
I'm
and it
serious.
was only quarter
Yeah.
of a page, not even a page.
All Black
That's
history.
right.
It was
Yeah,
all
yeah.
history.
And that was American history.
Yep.
Took all Black history.
Yeah.
But you see,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Miss Curtis. I was gonna say,
No, but you see, I'm sorry, dear. You see the reason for the resentment of foreigners?
Yeah. Yeah.
They started this
Mhm,
to divide people.
mhm.
Now, a foreigner could come in here and could tell you where to find Staten Island because he read about it.
Yep.
But then you who were sitting here and were never taught and didn't even know where to find Staten Island resent foreigners
Mhm.
because you think they have come in to take over, they're coming to rule when they created the system.
I think and it is true. And I think also what we were taught, I like the quote that said, we're committing educational malpractice
Oh,
because
yeah.
I think we all have a malpractice suit.
Suit,
The
yeah.
names, yeah, and I think what was given to us, of course, was selected and the people that they thought were safe to teach us about. For example, for me, like Malcolm X, I didn't really know of Malcolm X or learn about Malcolm X until I was in college and I read his autobiography. Well, I shouldn't have said that. What I heard was negative. And
Right.
until I read his autobiography myself, was I able to, have a realistic view of the man, because everything that was portrayed was negative. So they teach us what they think is safe to learn.
Yep. Absolutely.
Well, I was reading the same books in Texas.
Mm.
And the same names that you've mentioned, George Washington Carver, I knew had something to do with peanuts. Martin Luther King Jr.'s name, I certainly knew, Rosa Parks, but a lot of names we didn't really learn the meaning of them. So Harriet Tubman, I knew had something called the Underground Railroad, but didn't really delve into what that all entailed and what that really was.
Ooh.
Oh, I don't know what that was.
Yes.
In this sentence in here, Cheryl Vaughn mentioned it about the founding of America as being a divine event.
Mhm.
And Kelly Brown Douglas writes quite a bit about that in her writings. And when you start with history in 1620, the Pilgrims arrived and God ordained it, and this is a
Yep.
Christian nation,
Mhm.
then you see how that carries over into today. God intends us to be this way, and
Yeah.
we're this city on the hill, this light for the world,
Mhm.
and it just clouds everything.
Mhm. Yeah.
I always remember in 2019, I took the kids from the church to Washington, D.C. to the African American Museum.
Mhm.
And, they were walking around and exclaiming about, all the different things that, of course, they have no idea about. And there was this German couple with their 3 children. And I can't remember what we were talking about. The kids were asking about, how if you were married, you had to have a piece of paper to go visit your spouse. So we were there explaining the whole thing to them. And she said, oh, she introduced herself and she asked like where we were from and what we were. And the kids were telling her, they're from this church in Brooklyn and da 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 da. And she stood there and she explained to her children why it was important for them to be in the museum. Because one of the kids was like, well, there's always one child. Why are we here? I want to leave, da 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 da. And she stood there and she explained to them why it was important for them to be there. And she was like, because these children were born here, but no one ever told them that this was their history. Because she told me she had been born here, but her parents were German. So they had moved back to Germany for her to go to school in Germany because they thought the education system there, of course, like everybody, was better than here. But now she had moved back with her children, and she was explaining to them that the educational system here does not teach the history that they're learning in the museum. Hence the reason she brought them to the museum. And it was like, these young children that are here, that you're seeing here, have no idea that this is their history because they don't get taught that in school. And like, she stood up there talking to the kids for like a good half an hour, telling them how glorious and wonderful it was that, you know, we had brought them there so that they can know their history and they need to pay attention to it because this is the only place they will ever learn it. And I was like, okay, and she's from Germany. So it goes back to what Ms. Curtis said, like they do that to make us seem like foreigners or, you know, the evil one, because we are the great America and every other country is less than America. When it's, you know, it's not, that's not the fact.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Thank you all. Miss Nadine, would you pick up here?
Good evening. At the start of 2019, 2.5 decades after I first learned of the year 1619 in the pages of a book my teacher gave me, most Americans still did not know that date. As the 400-year anniversary approached that August, I understood that, like so much of the uncomfortable history of our country, this momentous date would likely come and go with little acknowledgement of its significance. But by 2019, I was no longer a curious teenager attending a public high school in a small Midwestern town. I now worked at one of the most powerful media institutions in the world. I wanted to try to use that global platform to help force a confrontation with our pasts and the foundations upon which this country was built. I made a simple pitch to my editors. The New York Times Magazine should create a special issue that would mark the 400th anniversary by exploring the unparalleled impact of African slavery on the development of our country and its continuing impact on our society. The issue would bring slavery and the contributions of Black Americans from the margins of the American story to the center, where they belong, by arguing that slavery and its legacy have profoundly shaped modern American life, even as that influence had been shrouded or discounted. The issue would pose and answer these questions. What would it mean to reframe our understanding of US history by considering 1619 as our country's origin point, the birth of our defining contradictions, the seed of so much of what has made us unique? How might that reframing change how we understand the unique problems of the nation today? Its stark economic inequality, its violence, its world-leading incarceration rates, its shocking segregation, its political divisions, its stingy social safety net. How might it help us understand the country's best qualities, developed over a centuries-long struggle for freedom, equality, and pluralism, a struggle whose DNA could also be traced to 1619? How would looking at contemporary American life through this lens help us better appreciate the contributions of Black Americans, not only to our culture, but also to our democracy itself? I wanted to do for other Americans what reading Lenore Bennett's book and absorbing decades of scholarship on Black American history had done for me. I wanted people to know the date 1619 and to contemplate what it means that slavery predates nearly every other institution in the United States. I wanted them to be transformed by this understanding as I have been. As soon as I received the green light, I reached out to nearly 24 scholars covering the fields of history, economics, law, sociology, and the arts who specialize in slavery and its legacy, and convene a brainstorming session at the New York Times. I asked them to help us produce a list of modern American institutions and phenomena that could be traced back to slavery. We filled a whiteboard with ideas, and then over the next 6 months, the magazine worked to create a project that would try to unflinchingly tell a 400-year story that connected the past to the present. Every day, I felt the weight of this responsibility and the height of the stakes. I immersed myself in the sorrow of the suffering of millions of Black people and the depravity of those who visited that suffering upon them, but also in the audacious resistance and resilience of Black Americans. I read every word of the project. I looked at every image. On the day when we printed the pages of the magazine and tacked them to the wall to review before publishing the issue, I turned to my dear friend Wesley Morris, who had written an essay about music for the project. We wrapped our arms around each other and sobbed. The night before publication, sleep taunted, refusing to grant me grace. As I lay in bed, my mind flicked back to that teenage girl in high school, the daughter and granddaughter of people born onto a repurposed slave labor camp in the deepest South. People who could not have imagined their progeny would one day rise to a position to bring forth such a project. I also worried, what if we told a story that centered slavery and Black Americans and, well, no one read it? What if despite all of our work, no one actually cared? On Sunday, August 18, the day we published the magazine in print, tweets and Instagram posts and videos began popping up all over the country. People were telling stories of going to store after store in search of it, only to find all the copies of the Sunday New York Times sold out. A man in North Carolina posted a video of himself looking giddy, his fingers wrapped around the magazine, saying he'd driven miles, but he finally snagged a copy. Parents stashed copies away to pass on to their children. Incarcerated people wrote to me, seeking the issue. Over the coming weeks, readers started holding 1619 reading clubs, and the 1619 hashtag on Instagram showed teachers decorating their classrooms with 1619 project art and families baking 1619 project cookies. Across the country, at libraries, museums, cultural centers, and schools, people gathered to talk about the 1619 project and slavery's impact on America. Then US Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer spoke about the project in the Capitol Visitor Center's Emancipation Hall. He related a story I told in my opening essay about my father and the American flag. In the run-up to the 2020 presidential election, Democrats seeking the nomination mentioned the project in their speeches. Educators in all 50 states began teaching a curriculum based on the project, and I met hundreds of high school students who somewhat breathlessly recounted the same off-kilter sense of exhilaration while reading the 1619 project that I had felt reading before the Mayflower. Black students especially told me that for the first time in their lives, they'd experienced a feeling usually reserved for white Americans, a sense of ownership of, belonging in, and influence over the American story. Arteria Griggs, who attended a public high school in Chicago, the first district in the country to make the project part of its curriculum, told a reporter from the Chicago Sun-Times what the project helped her realize. We were the founding fathers. We put so much into the US and we made the foundation. Another student, Brenton Skaggs, said, now that I'm aware of the full history of America without it being whitewashed or anything, it's kind of makes me see things in a different light. I feel like I have to carry myself better because I know what my ancestors went through. I will never forget the woman I met after giving a talk in New Orleans, one of the most brutal slave trading cities in our country. Almost 90 years old, she came up and hugged me, wiping her eyes as she thanked me for helping birth a project that had allowed her to release the shame that comes with being told that the only thing Black people have contributed to this country is our brute labor. I always knew the truth, she told me, but I didn't have the facts of what happened. On one of my last trips before the pandemic, I brought my 9-year-old daughter, Naja, with me to a talk I gave at the university that Thomas Jefferson founded in Charlottesville, Virginia, a university built largely by enslaved people to educate the sons of the men who owned them. Before the lecture, we took a walk through the town square where we saw the site of a slave auction block, and we marveled, her hand in mine, at some numbers recently scrawled on the lamppost by the placard marking the spot, 1619.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We just have a couple of minutes before Compline. I don't know if somebody wanted to just share what your feelings were.
My feelings right this second is that I'm proud that we have fired Columbus.
Yes. Amen.
Feeling sad right now.
Mm-hmm.
It just reminds me I to think of that when, you know, it's like discovering, finding yourself. And I'm thinking about my Nina Simone song, which I usually sing when growing up, young, gifted, and Black. And that's the feeling I got.
Yeah.
Just,
There's a feeling of betrayal, at least that's a feeling that I feel, betrayed by the very system that, you know, that you wind up trusting because, well, they were your teachers. I mean, and they in themselves, I'm sure, are not bad people, but the whole system is set against telling the truth.
They still won't own up to it.
Mm-hmm.
I like the part that it said that we are the founding fathers of this country.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
And really, yes, our young people really need to hear this.
Yes. Yes.
That section was a real shocker.
Mm-hmm.
It really was a shocker. Because could you imagine these kids who didn't know that we were here all along?
Yep. Again, the media, the system, the whole thing makes it seem like people, you know, who came from Africa are outsiders, you know, and have nothing to contribute. Yet the whole thing is built on the backs of the women and men who came way before the Mayflower. So thank you all, and then we'll pick up from there next month. So well, just one, you have like 1 minute to tell me this, but what do you think about the approach, the way we're going to do this, the system that I came up with? Is this an okay way to do this? Read a little
It's
bit.
great.
Okay.
Yeah,
It's
Take
great.
some time.
Yes.
I think it's great.
All right, good. And then the next minute, I'm going to share a next thing. It's an advertisement. We are now studying in spirituality, the cloud of unknowing, and we're almost going to be finished with it in a few weeks. And then we're picking up the next mystic. And some of you have been studying these different mystics with us, and we've gone through Howard Thurman, and we've gone through Martin Luther King. The next mystic we're picking up on is John Lewis, and he's a contemporary of all of us online today. He truly lived Christianity, and so that's just kind of an advertisement for a couple of weeks from now when we start John Lewis. You may be interested in the spirituality of John Lewis. What my approach has been is we do a contemporary person, and then we do a person or spirituality from the past, and they all get integrated into one understanding of who Christ is for all of us. So
Is that the John Lewis that died about
yes,
2
yes,
or 2 years, 3 maybe?
yep,
Recently.
yes, that's
Okay,
the John Lewis. Yep. So a politician, but a wonderful, holy man. So and to read his story and to read about his own spirituality, his own prayer life, and how that influenced everything he did is really important.
So the name of the book is John Lewis?
No, the name of the book that we're going to do is John Lewis, Carry On.
Carry On.
Reflections for a New Generation.
Oh, God. Okay.
But I'm going to say this a million more times. We have.
Okay, all right.
Okay. Yeah. All right. But and then I'll use the other material to add to this book. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank
All
you.
right. And Compline begins
Thank you.
now. Okay.